Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another Rowing Chat. I'm Rebecca Caro, and today I want to remind you about Row Tours. It's a new rowing holiday company headed by Olympian Pete Wells. You can join the Row Tours team in a mini rowing vacation ahead of the World Rowing Championships this summer. Choose from either 3, 4, or a 6-day rowing boat tour down the Danube River, starting in Passau and ending in Linz in time for the World Championships. You can get more information and pricing at www.rowtours.com/rowing-chat. I also want to remind you that Will Ruth, who's also a podcaster on the Rowing Chat Network, his book, Rowing Stronger, is now published in a second edition. It was hugely popular when he first published it, and it takes in a lot of the work that he talks about with his co-hosts on the Strength Coach Roundtable podcast. We've got a special offer just for you because you're a listener. Will has given all of us the option to get an additional free download of the first chapter. You can get it from rowing.chat/sponsors and click on the link. Now, today I'm joined by Martin Cross. Hey, Martin, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. I was just reflecting when I used to coach Pete Wells, who you mentioned in the ad, and like not a lot, but is obviously brother Matt. And I remember doing a session with him at Molesey, and it was kind of imagine doing like 20 strokes flat out, imagining your favourite character in the world that you like to be doing the 20 strokes. And I think Wellesley chose Keith Moon, the drummer, who was like mad. And you should have seen him go on those 20 strokes. So I don't know if he's going to go down the Danube like that on the rowing tours, but it'll be quite something.
Well, I'm going to go try that right away. Yeah. Martin, introduce yourself to the listeners and tell them a little bit about your background in rowing.
Yeah, well, I guess most listeners might remember me not for how I look, which has kind of changed a bit now, but for my voice. And certainly when I go to World Cup regattas or World Championships, people recognise me because they go, oh, you're the bloke who does the commentary, generally with Greg Searle or Sarah Cook, or some of the other great commentators we have on FISA. So I do world rowing commentary. And I guess the question, what qualifies me to do that? So I guess my tagline is after Steve Redgrave, who's a name most people relate to in rowing, famous British rower with 5 Olympic golds, I'm Britain's most capped ever rower. So I did 18 consecutive years in the British team while having a full-time job, which was a bit mad. And in that time, I was fortunate enough to win a couple of Olympic medals, one of them gold, several World Championship medals, lots of other things. And I'm pretty much a rowing geek. If I hold my hands up now, you know, I still row quite regularly. I write about rowing, broadcast about rowing, and yeah, generally that geek tag is quite good for me.
I can relate to that. Do you remember the rowing geek test that Rachel Quarrell had on her website back in the day?
Yeah, she is a rowing geek actually. Yeah, a worthy one. Yes, I do. I'd pass that.
Yeah, I seem to recall that if you had almanacs or rowing magazines from more than one country, you got maximum points.
Yeah, I don't think I have on my shelves, but I think up there I've got ludicrous almanacs from like 1973 when I first started rowing.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, with people on the front. Yeah, so I might do that.
Now, Martin, you're a great observer of both the domestic scene in the UK and also the international scene. And I want to kick off by asking for your views on some of the changes that we're already seeing happening at the Olympic level and obviously how that trickles down to the World Championship level. What do you think about these changes in reducing the number of lightweight events and introducing a new heavy 4 event for women?
Well, I think the notion of gender equality has been something that I guess has been long delayed. I think that it's been a great thing for the sport. which really has come at the expense of lightweights. And I think the intransigence of the IOC, or the unwillingness to expand rowing, has been one of the reasons for that. So they won't give rowing more medals. So rowing's had to stay at 14 events. And so gender equality is kind of like a no-brainer. It's almost like the boat race for women couldn't go on the tideway. It had to stay at Henley because it wasn't ready, it wasn't competitive enough. And then all of a sudden it goes and races on the tideway, and people wonder how it ever wasn't as part of that great sort of festival of rowing. And it's the same with women's fours in the games, that really you could look at and say, well, a number of countries, maybe some of the Balkan countries, women's rowing is not so strong in, say, Croatia, crew rowing, or Serbia, where men's rowing is much stronger. And you kind of go, well, we'll wait until that happens. But basically, you have to introduce it at Olympic level, and then national Olympic committees start funding. And you see that already in some of the big federations. And clearly, countries like the States are in pole position because they've got such strong women's programs already. Britain and Australia, I guess, not far behind Canada. But, I think it will have an impact on these countries. I think it's interesting seeing Italy, which has never traditionally been strong in women's rowing, that's now got quite a number of really strong female rowers. And I think that's only going to continue.
I definitely echo what you say, and equalizing the sweep crews, I think, is really a powerful move. I have to say my regrets are in the smaller nations who benefit obviously from FISA's development program and who tend to send a single sculler, that actually they were the ones who potentially, if they had two athletes, a lightweight crew was a possibility.
Yeah. I think, FISA's, it's got to keep an eye out for this, the universality. So obviously the way it does that is by increasing, in terms of single sculls, men's and women's single sculls, like having as many nations as possible. So famously, I think, was it Eric the Eel in 2012 from one of the African nations? I can't remember which one.
He was a swimmer, yeah. I saw him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there was a guy, the rowing guy, that you can still see the clip on the BBC Sport website.
It wasn't Peter Egby, but it could have been.
Yeah, and so I think FISA are pretty astute in terms of what they do with smaller boats. I kind of think some people were advocating lightweight men's and women's singles as a possible option, I think, when we were looking at changes about gender equality, and that never got passed. So but there are a lot of men's and women's singles slots in the Olympics that keep the number of nations high, which is a pretty key indicator for the International Olympic Committee.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good thing. The big thing that I have observed, because going to the Olympics is something that my husband and I do. We've been doing it for a long time. And one of the things I've observed in the years since I've been doing that is that cycling has been very, very canny at diversifying the types of events that they run and that they've successfully got into the Olympic program. I mean, I remember when downhill speedy cyclocross was first put in, and now they have an enormous number of stadium events, road events, and then challenging events, which are almost like skateboarding. And it makes me wonder whether rowing couldn't have gone down that route.
Well, I think you're right, and I think it will. And I think the obvious thing for diversification is indoor rowing. And I mean, we can probably talk about coastal rowing, which looks to be more like one of the events that could get on the 2024 programme. But FISA's got a very active committee in terms of developing indoor rowing. It is a no-brainer that ought to be an Olympic sport, in my opinion. Not that I don't know whether how many youngsters you see in the gym or whether it's got teenage appeal, because I think with the IOC, it's really looking for sort of sexy sports that appeal to that sort of very young market. And I'm not quite sure whether ergs in the gym necessarily do that. But I do think it is a huge area in our sport, and it needs to be reflected in the Olympic movement. The question is what makes way for it. and either it has to be such a pressing thing that the IOC feel it's so attractive that it's going to add to their offering in Olympic Games, in which case maybe they might maybe they might make additional gold medals available more than the 14. But to me, that provides the options. I mean, the format that you could adopt. There's all sorts of interesting ways you can look, whether it's the same rowers in the rowing competition that you have an indoor element, and because they all have to do ergs to get selected, so why not do ergs to get Olympic gold medal as well? I mean, there are lots of creative options, but to me, that is what will happen. I would imagine probably by 2028 Olympics, and at the outside by 2032.
Wow. I personally would love to see a kind of omnium type event where you've got the all-round athletes who can both sweep, scull, erg, row a small boat, row a big boat. And I think that would be almost a blue ribboned event.
Yeah. What's interesting about that, Rebecca, is I think at the moment, you've got, first of all, a sport which is desperate to keep its identity of an endurance sport. So really, our sport is led by Jean-Christophe, who's doing, a great job in terms of trying to maintain the integrity of the sport within, world rowing, within the Olympic movement, and while trying to react to the IOC. He didn't necessarily come in as Thomas Bach's man. He had, in fact, quite the opposite. He had Denny Oswald's support, but he has now got on the IOC, and he's very keen to keep rowing's values at the same time as show it's flexible. So, they want to keep 2,000 meter rowing, and they're looking to be flexible, like in Los Angeles, by having a shorter course or a different course for the 2028 games to make it more cheap. But they're looking to develop coaster rowing as an extra thing to seemingly say, well, we're listening to the IOC. When Thomas Bach came to Plovdiv last year at the World Championships and said, look, you either adapt or die, which was a pretty stark warning. I mean, he didn't say that in those words, but I'm paraphrasing. The thing with Jean-Christophe is he's quite a conservative guy with a small c. In fact, he's very conservative. And he's very stage by stage. So he doesn't go in for a lot of those, like, let's have these omnium type events, let's be creative. I think that's something that he'll have to evolve into. And he is the leader of our sport. And I think you've really got to get him round to, this is a good idea. This is the way the sport should go. And I think then things will happen. And at the moment, I think he's into, let's keep the endurance, the 2K event, but let's look at making it like 1800. I mean, anyone that has rowed Mannheim in the docks, as I have, I mean, it was 1850. You never really bothered that much. I mean, it was a decent race, and the Olympics could be the same if it's cheaper. Coaster rowing is another option that he's going down, but I don't see him yet ready to grasp these kind of let's get a team of 8 rowers, or mix them up, male and female, do quad sculls, doubles, and then all get into the 8, which I think personally is a great option. I think he's yet to arrive at that space. I may be doing him a disservice, but I think those changes will take longer.
Interesting. A small digression. I raced in France, in the south of France, a long time ago. And at the regatta, they had a wonderful prize, which was Jean-Christophe Rolland and Michel Andrieux Eau de Parfum. And we kind of wondered what this perfume smelled like.
Yeah. Well, they are big heroes. I mean, my son actually rowed with Jean-Christophe when he was at Molesey, because he rowed with the sort of veterans, the masters group we call the leg ends. And I took him out for an outing because we go to France and we go to the Com Rowing Club sometimes there. And it emerged that, that he'd rowed with Jean-Christophe Rolland, and all of a sudden his stature in the eyes of everybody had just grew by 2 or 3 feet because JC is such a god in French rowing.
Fantastic. It's like adventure tourism, only better.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about the World Rowing Championships, which of course is the event that FISA can completely control. It is the way they want it. At the moment, we have juniors, under 23s, seniors and masters as a slightly different category. And they've started running an indoor rowing event as well. What progress do you think they've made with inclusivity?
Well, I think the most obvious thing with inclusivity, we spoke about gender equality, which was, I think, a big issue for our sport increasingly in the world we live in today. I think rowing is making fantastic strides in Paralympic sport, and you know, it's tried to be. I think moving it to 2K, there's a lot of opposition. I think, you know, when you talk of coaches and you know, they're like, why does it have to be 2K? Boring, all the rest of it. You know, to my money, you have to make it part of our sport. You know, there is no reason why Paralympic rowers can't race over 2K. I think it will be more competitive. You know, I think the Paralympics is a massive draw. So I think that is making our sport much more inclusive. And, you know, even there are TV adverts. I saw one last night on, you know, about, it happened to be for people who trying to recover from accidents, like road accidents. And what it showed was not Paralympic, but rowers, you know, arms and body rowers on some river, not at any high standard, but rowing was part of the sort of therapy, and it was an image being used. And I think that's a very strong image, and it does project inclusivity. I think, you know, to the extent one might say that's been at the cost of lightweight rowing. And I think, you know, lightweight's in under 23 now. The funding for that is obviously under threat. And you know, it impacted the lightweight fours, and it's going to impact lightweight men and lightweight women. And you could say, well, that's again part of the problem the sport's going to face. The pressure there's coming from national Olympic committees. You know, I did see the Irish Olympic pair haven't got, or Paul, is it? Yeah, the lads who won in 2017 haven't got funding from their federation, and they tried to go up in weight, but you know, they didn't quite have the pace. So the pressure there is coming from national Olympic committees, not FISA. So FISA will always react to demand for events. So I think FISA is trying to put on events. Ultimately, the logic of the decisions they've made is that, you know, lightweights are not going to be included in the world stage. That won't affect some nations. Like America's got a massively strong lightweight rowing program. You know, Princeton, Cornell are great, and you know, the lightweights in those American universities have a fantastic scene, and they aren't dependent on what World Rowing does. But clearly, a lot of other lightweight rowers are, and you know, and they're going to have to find their home in an open weight category.
Thinking back to when lightweights were introduced, was 76 the first Olympics, or was they a World Championships before then?
No, it was. So the first Olympics, I think, for lightweights was 96. So the last Olympics was 92. That had like the Cox pairs, if you remember. That was one of the events that made way, and the Cox four for the lightweight fours and the lightweight doubles.
And so at the world level, when was it lightweights introduced at the World Rowing Championship? Well, the Europeans, was it?
No, I remember. So my first World Championships that I went to as a 16-year-old was Lucerne in 1974. And I remember seeing, I think it was Andy Mitchell-Moore stroking the Australian lightweight four to win a gold medal at that championships. And I think that was the first lightweights in the World Championships. Someone you may prove me wrong on that, but it's been in the World Championships a while.
And was it introduced for a specific reason? I mean, it'd be interesting to get the context as to what the situation, the world view was then, and why it got introduced, and now why we're looking at potentially the end of lightweights as a racing category. Well, not rowing.
I think it was interesting. If you look at how rowing was structured there, you know, you had the men's rowing championships one week, and then you had women's and lightweights. So lightweights got in with the women. So you didn't really see the lightweights because I think they raced separately, as I recall. Somebody may prove me wrong on that. and they've always, because they weren't in the Olympics, so they've always had a separate kind of championships. I think, I think in the year of Los Angeles in '84, maybe they went up to Montreal to have their own championships. So they've always been seen a little bit apart, but included. And then, then they came together in the same week. And it used to be, you had such fantastic races. I remember, names like Wim van Bellegem, the Belgian lightweight single sculler. Frans Gerbel, he was a complete nutcase, the Dutch lightweight single sculler. I remember him qualifying in Copenhagen in '87 in the semi-final, and then he did a wind down, and you kind of could row back down. And then the other semi-final, the second semi-final came, and they were going through like 1,000, like 1,100 meters, and Gerbel just picked it up and started going flat out, and thought, right, I'll just test my pace with them. And you had characters like that, the British guy Peter Haining and so on. And then the lightweight eights was just a phenomenal event, and that's been completely destroyed now. Because of the Olympic pressure and because of funding. We might come on to funding pressures. Ultimately, it's money, and so sports are throwing money at the Olympic program, and they don't have money for the lightweights.
It's interesting, though, that the weigh-in you pointed out via the women's championship, very similar to actually how the boat race was, because the Henley boat races used to be the women and lightweights. And now, of course, the lightweights are also, I think, moving to the tideway. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on that because I'm not 100% certain, but I do believe that they are having an extra race on the tideway.
I think it's a different day. Yeah. It's brilliant. And let's talk about the boat race, since we've kind of got to it in a roundabout way. Young James Cracknell. Now, I, and probably you, remember Andy Ripley having a crack at getting into the Cambridge Blue Boat, aged, I think, 54. He didn't even make Goldie. Crackers.
Yeah, the thing about Andy was a rugby player that came to rowing late, and he was good on the erg, and he rowed at scullers. And I think that technical expertise he just didn't have, because I think a lad like him who's really, really fit, and I remember him with a lot of fondness, would have made Goldie, and his erg score would have made, the Blue Boat. But obviously what Crackers has got is that phenomenal technique. I did see in some interviews, he said he hadn't rowed since 2004, which is not strictly true, because I remember, last year at the Veterans Head, we had a couple of Molesey sort of Masters eights, and Crackers was in one. He was rowing with George Nash, who just won. Nash was in the 7 seat. Dan Ritchie, who was Olympic silver medalist, I think, from Carapiro in 2010, was stroking at 8. I think Crackers got in the 4 seat, and they won the Veterans Head. So obviously, he's been rowing. I've rowed with him, not recently, but a few times at most. So he's not like he's given up rowing. But clearly, I think for him to come back and it's a whole nother level to do masters rowing and then to go in with what you're doing in the Blue Boat, and that's just phenomenal. I have to say, I don't think I never doubted he'd get in, because I knew what ergs he's capable of, and the guys that I row in masters rowing just thought, well, probably, he's motivated, he can do that. And I think maybe it's more of a surprise for people that might think he's just come back and wow, he seems old. But, I think now, what is it, 60 is a new 40 or something like that, what they're saying. People are doing things older than they used to be, 20, 30 years ago. Nevertheless, it doesn't diminish his achievement.
It is a fantastic achievement. I totally take my hat off to him. I have to say that he probably will never say this, but I strongly suspect that the biggest challenge was not the physical challenge. I suspect all that muscle memory is good, and, getting back to fitness was good. But the way a big squad like that is run, and obviously the multiculturalism, it's very different from being in one of the top 2 boats in the GB system and just having Jürgen. And I suspect mentally that was probably a bigger challenge. You are not expected to contribute. You're expected to jump however high the coach says.
Yeah, well, like he rocked up at the World Championships in Plovdiv, and we were doing commentary, and I happened to be in the erg room, and then like Cracknell, he'd come in with the BBC later, and he's like straight on the erg because he's basically saying, "I've got to do this score." It was clearly the thing, "I've got to do this score," and he's got mental pressure. But I think from what I've heard, and I haven't talked to James specifically, but from what I've heard, he has been like a breath of fresh air in the squad. He's been very humble. He's been encouraged people to talk about the vulnerability. He's encouraged people to talk about why they're good as a group. He's really been a fantastic squad member, and I think that's gone into obviously being in the crew. So he's showing real wisdom, I think, which you would hope when you get older, you're not just, because I can remember rowing with him like as a 20-year-old, so I know what he was like then.
Headbanger?
Sorry?
A bit of a headbanger?
Yeah, a lot of a headbanger. Yeah, I mean, he had a pretty checkered career actually early on in rowing, and he decided not to do the '92 Olympics and go and play rugby for various reasons. But I've heard some really sort of impressive things about how he's been in the squad.
It was very interesting, that sort of leadership, and I loved your choice of word of humble, and it brought to mind an anecdote that Tim McLaren told me, the Australian coach, when he was coaching in the American sweep team, and Jamie Coven was trying for a comeback. Very similar, an older guy, already much medalled. And Tim said, we're coming down to selection times, and I have one-on-ones with the athletes. And Jamie comes into the room to speak to me, and he sits down, and the first thing he says is, "Well, Tim, how can I help you?" And Tim said, I was floored. I have never, ever in all his years coaching had an athlete look at the job from my point of view.
Yeah. Jamie's a very impressive man, and he's flying at the moment. I mean, he did that double with his daughter, who's medalled at the junior championships, and I think she's at Harvard now. And I was with him in New York at the Power 10 dinner actually early this year, and I know he was kind of flirting a bit of maybe we could do the World Coastals together, but I'm not sure his daughter isn't tied up with academic stuff, but. He's a very impressive man, spends a lot of time with the Power 10 raising money for American rowing. He's obviously involved with the Henley Stewards. Lovely guy. And of course, former world champion in the single scull too.
That's right. He was the one who flipped when his gate came undone. I remember that.
I can't remember that. He was
racing Greg Searle. It was the year that Greg got his bronze, and I think I'm right.
No. Greg got his bronze, and then Jamie Coven won the gold. It might have been another year
after that. I think you're right. Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about the boat race sponsorship. It is said that the current sponsorship expires after this race, due at Easter time. What's in the pipeline, do you think, for this race? Because it's so quirky, anachronistic, so high profile, such great opportunity for the sport, and yet who wants to put their hand in their pocket and come up with £1 million for the next 4 years?
Well, I think what's interesting is if you look at the current climate for sports sponsorship, which overall, so it is undoubtedly much harder for sports to get the same level of sponsorship that they were probably getting 10, 15 or 20 years ago. Just take a look at rowing when it had Camelot and then it had Siemens, the big electrical firm, as a sponsor. And, basically since London, it's had no one. Rowing's obviously a fairly low profile sport. The boat race is much more significant. And clearly, they had BMY Mellon and then they had Newton, which kind of rock and roll with the women's boat race. And that had massive publicity getting it onto the Tideway. But in effect, companies don't really want to spend that much money on supporting sports now. And the boat race has this particular target of money it needs. And as an event, it isn't particularly attractive because it is only once a year. And that is obviously, I guess, one of the advantages that it's on that day. But clearly, you know, if you're going to put money into a sport, you kind of want exposure more than just once a year. If you could be guaranteed a James Cracknell, so when I used to write for the Guardian and stuff like that, I mean, you know, the Guardian doesn't write about rowing practically at all now. You know, they don't have money for rowing correspondence, but I would get rung up by sports writers interested to know what Cracknell and Pinson, because they were two names, were doing. And Cracknell still got a draw, as we saw. You know, the stories about Cracknell weren't really on the sports pages. They were on, you know, the inside front pages of the Times and the Guardian and the Telegraph and that sort of thing. If he was going to be rowing every year, then that might be more attractive, but he's not. And so I think the boat race will struggle for a sponsor unless it gets into, you know, they're really well connected, and like Beefeater Gin sponsorship, which used to run the boat race, happened upon because there was a guy friendly to the boat race, I think an old blue, we ought to sponsor. Now, what's fascinating is how the boat race, so, you know, as I said earlier, I've come back from the American Power 10 dinner in January, and, you know, American International Rowing doesn't have really much funding at all. So the guys that have got money, the wealthy guys, get together, they basically run funding to support American international rowers. And in effect, that's what's happening with the boat race now. So there is now, Oxford have created the Topolski Foundation, so you can go online and look at this, you know, which is a great sort of organisation. I gather it's had a target to raise £20 million, and I think it might be halfway there. It's a very altruistic, you know, body. The governance is very, very tight. So, you know, it's not just about Oxford winning, because they will release money if a similar thing happens for Cambridge. So the future there is possibly that you've got this endowment and federation, you know, that can support the high level of training and the kind of coaching and the boats, and be independent of sponsors, and sponsors can bung in and maybe, you know, subsidise the race costs. To me, that's probably the future of boat race funding, because it is a very tight climate, and, you know, outside of like massive sports like football or soccer in the UK, it's difficult. I gather even in rugby in the Six Nations, you know, RBS were the sponsors, and the RFU or the rugby authorities thought they could get more money, and they couldn't, and then they had to go cap in hand back to RBS, who then paid them less money for the title sponsorship.
But so the boat race did that with exchanging. Do you remember exchanging had a 3 or 4 year, 3 years, and then they did a 4th year and a 5th year? And there was a pattern through the sort of 90s and early 2000s of financial services firms using the boat race to build profile ahead of a stock market listing. And as a professional marketer, I can see the value in that, because the sorts of people who watch the boat race are often working in the City of London. They're the people who are going to advise their clients to buy the shares. Yeah,
and, you know, to be fair with BNY Mellon, I mean, we did a veterans 8 at the head of the chart with, you know, and it was Redders and Pinson, Johnny Serm, and people with a profile Olympic medals. And then they had people like Kath Granger going over doing the women's 8, Kath Bishop, you know, really high profile female rowers. And BNY basically made films of us talking about, this is how you win, this is how you compete, this is the analogy with business. And you know, they could obviously see a crossover, and they've kind of mined that. Well, I mean, that's got a shelf life, and, you know, I think that's for somebody else to look to invest in. I mean, obviously we don't know, they haven't got another sponsor yet, but, you know, it's a tough market out there.
It really is. And interesting point that you made earlier about having a high profile athlete. In the rules of the boat race, recruiting to your team is not allowed. And yet, God bless Dan Topolski, and may he rest in peace, but he used to take an annual trip to America to go around the universities and talent spot. Is it possible that they might review the race rules, and in the same way that some sailing races have a crew that includes usually it's actually a sponsor who gets one seat in the boat as a passenger, you wouldn't want a passenger in the boat race, but could they not look to both recruit a really high profile individual?
But they'd have to be really screwed with money for that. I mean, the boat race has got rules that are like, you know, it is an amazing event. It's been going since the early 19th century, and the people running it are very well aware of the traditions. And I think that's an interesting idea. I think, you know, you would have to basically be like drawing blood from a stone to get them to change the rules of the boat race. I think in that way, it is fascinating what you say, but it is a remarkable event because it has that tradition. And ultimately, it's very simplistic in terms of challenges of two universities. There are lots of things, you know, that I wonder about the boat race, but clearly it's a successful event, and it's an iconic event in world sport.
It surely is. And I'm sure where there's a will, there's a way. And I look forward to learning more about the Topolski Foundation. Let's move on to British rowing. There's been a hell of a brouhaha in the Twitterverse recently about British rowing has had a long-standing goal to own more race events. It doesn't own Henley Royal Regatta. It started trying to do sprint racing in town centres, and it of course has the National Rowing Championship, which has struggled, I think it's fair to say, to find a place in the calendar because it doesn't represent school rowing, because they have the school championships separately. It doesn't represent masters rowing. And now it's been moved to a date that has upset a lot of people. What's going on there, Martin?
Well, I think it would depend who you talk to, because everyone would have a view on that. Clearly, you know, rowing had a new CEO, Andy Parkinson, come into the sport, and I think probably a lot of the strategy about what the sport should try and do has probably been driven by Andy. Certainly, I think the sprint rowing is something that he's keen on, and I am, without wanting to put words in his mouth, but my understanding is that he would really like that to be part of the Olympic scene, and he would like sprint events to be in there. I certainly, you know, it's one of the comments made when I was at the Power 10 dinner in New York, that the CEO of American Rowing was sort of kind of making common cause with, you know, let's get this type of event in the Olympics. So obviously, I think the sport has done, British Rowing has done very well to get that event covered on the TV. I think it was on the red button as opposed to a live channel. But, you know, I remember from being involved in organising the 500-metre televised sprint event in the 80s on the surface.
DAF power sprints. I remember that.
No, Goldstrom did the DAF. We did the Serpentine, which was international.
Okay.
We never made any money. We covered our costs. We had sponsors from London Electricity Board. We had sponsorship from Air France. We had sponsorship from Westminster City Council, and they all paid in kind. But we, as a company, Rowing Promotions, we made no money. And I'd be very, you know, in a sense, as a commercial proposition, how are you going to make money for that? And ultimately, that's what's going to generate a successful event. The national championships, I mean, when Nottingham first came on as a course, so I'm talking now 71, 72. So I remember going up before the 72 Olympics and before the crews went and watching all the international crews race at the national championships with national crews. I remember in 75, actually, when I was a junior, you went to the national championships. It was in July, and we were lined up there. There was, you know, we were next to Jim Clark's crew that were racing in the World Championships. And they were the British team for the World Championships. And they were racing a Great Four with, I think, Christian McLeod from Lady Margaret College, you know, who were fast. And they were a bit psyched out about racing them. And, you know, and we were there as juniors. And the starter went, you know, said, "Are you ready?" And John, our bowman, put his hand up and said no. And the squad four thought it was a start and went off. And then And basically they went back and they called us, you know, lots of 4-letter words for doing that because they were so wound up. But in effect, you had everybody there in July at the national championships, and what's happened now is you've got a squad system, which is kind of, you know, there is no room for that in the squad system. And you've got athletes from universities that go into the under-23 squad system, and there isn't any space for that. So the squad system and the drive for success in that has essentially destroyed the kind of, you know, the funness, or let's go to the national championships. And you know, you can't have a squad system with a national championships, it seems to me, in a successful way like we used to have. So you're always struggling to try and work out how that's going to happen.
It does work in the Southern Hemisphere, and the reason is because of dates. Because the World Rowing Championships is August or September, and so down here in Australia and New Zealand, every single athlete races the national championships because at the nationals, that's where the selectors pick the people they want to go to final trials. So they've all got to be there unless they have a medical reason. So you genuinely do get a week-long regatta that reflects every single part of the sport, with the possible exception of some secondary schools, because they also have a separate championship a little bit later. But like the old British system, I think the under-18s race at the national championships. So you can do it, but it means it, in the UK, it ends up in a very unfriendly time of year, which is probably March, April time.
The logic is, like, so New Zealand, you know, the lads from the Southern Hemisphere go back and they're racing 2Ks down there. So they're basically, you know, they have a nice 2K race. But the logic is that what rowers should do here is that the national team, you know, should have much more of a profile at the fours head. I know they have a bit of a profile, and some of the other heads, not just, you know, the eights head, but it's kind of, it's so protective in the squad what they do, you know, and even some of the rows at Boston are cancelled, but you know, I'd like to see them racing in more heads like they do in New Zealand, with more club rowers, because you know, when they're not racing like in the World Cup events in the summer, you know, there's more space for them to do more competitive events, but they don't, because they're in this very controlled squad system. So something's got to give if things are going to change. You know, I think trying to manufacture like a 2K race for the squad to be involved in is not going to happen. Like,
well, they tried it. They tried it in October, and all I remember is reading tweets from people saying, "This is the first time I've ever been to the national championship," and that was from people with world and Olympic medals. And I was like, "Well, that's actually not a disgrace, but it's a reflection of the squad system, the early recruitment, and the fact that if you didn't go as a schoolboy and you learned to row in world-class stars or something, why would you go there?" So. Yeah. Let's talk about domestic rowing below the international level. Is it a shame that there isn't a single event that is a national rowing championships?
Well, I think what we tend to do is we kind of look and see what events there are. And, you know, so typically I will look at a season, and Henley is the focus, as it always has been. And I do remember when the national championships came on, you know, it was after Henley, but it was still a significant, you know, event. And I've got medals in my medal cabinet back there of national championships. So I was very proud to win them. And, you know, there were still national schools, and I would do national championships. And they meant quite a lot, and they were very competitive. But now you look at regattas that mean a lot. And, you know, I mean, Brooks and other crews go to Ghent. And that's kind of got a very British, you know, aspect to it. You know, if you hear they go to Ratsburg, and Molesey went there last year, I think, as well. I think, and so you kind of go, they're the regattas that mean something, and then you've kind of got these sorts of this triumvirate of races at Dorney, of Wallingford,
Met and Harlow.
So, in as much as, you know, it works as it works. So the national championships has fallen into disrepute. I think British rowing feel that they should have a national championships, but what's a whole system has grown up around the sport, and you kind of then got to break that down. And what they try to do is smash it in, because they're trying to preserve this brand, and they're trying, as you say, to get this identity of owning events. I'm not sure that's going to be successful, given the strength of what's grown up around it and what clubs do.
It sounds like the weekend they've picked is particularly challenging for a couple of reasons. Mostly the availability of umpires, of which there are only a certain number in this country who have multi-lane. And it's the same weekend as I think the National Masters, which is in Strathclyde, and the same weekend as Reading Town Regatta. And there are other regattas also on that weekend.
Just popped into my head. The one thing I thought you were going to ask in terms of British rowing was the changes at the top in terms of performance directors and chief coaches.
Let's talk about that too then. Off you go.
Well, I think it's it's a very different type of performance director now from what it used to be with David Tanner. And I think what's been reflected now is the way that coaches can relate to their athletes. And I think in particular with Tomo, who clearly is a coach with an outstanding medal record, from back in 1996 when he coached the Australians. Gold in Atlanta, and then all of the medals that he's been involved with, either coaching or as chief coach. But he's got quite an abrasive manner, and I think Kath Granger has written about that in her biography, and other athletes. There was I think an action brought by, I can't remember her name.
It was one of the girls in the 8, yeah.
Yeah, not being selected. So, in as much as I think now, particularly with the millennial generation, that there are higher expectations about how you will be treated in sport. And I think now organisations are much more risk averse about their procedures and their policies. I think possibly under David Tanner, the previous performance director, he was prepared to make sure that, to be protective about his chief coaches. I don't think that's the case with Brendan Purcell now. And that, I think, it's a massive change, because to lose someone with that medal record is a big call. What is it, 18 months before the Olympics? And I'm not really as connected as I used to be, so I can't talk with great authority on that. For what I have heard, the women's squad is, inverted commas, happier. What that means, I don't know what that means.
But the men have had times in the past where they have been deeply unhappy with their head coach, and Mike Spracklin, a similarly successful and divisive coach. Those people who worked with him and they won, they love him, and other people felt very, very undermined and that they underperformed under him. So
what you have with the men, you have this fascinating thing of a very prescriptive training system at Caversham, and Jürgen Grubler runs it in the way that he does, and what you had after Rio, because people did not want to go through that system for another 4 years. When I say people, I mean Konstantin Louloudis, I mean who could easily be doing Tokyo, Paul Bennett, who could easily be doing Tokyo, George Nash, who could easily be doing Tokyo. These guys are all Olympic champions. And the issue is they do not want to go through the Caversham system. It's too much. They've done it. And even if you see, Louloudis, I mean, Louloudis was very picky about what years he did. He drift in and drift out. So it does take a toll, and it is for people that with a particular mentality. But what is affecting the British team now is retention, because clearly they have got no nailed on. Like, you know, going to Rio is like, well, the 8's winning gold medals, beating the Germans. The 4, you know, he can now bring a 4. That's a nailed on gold medal boat. Well, you look at British Rowing, and you go, well, where's your gold medal men's boat? And there isn't one. And one of the massive reasons for that is retention. So that's a real issue, because on the one hand, you've got this very rigid training program. And I think there have been, you know, whispers about how Grubler is working and changing that, you know, this year to be a bit more competitive, do more high rate stuff, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, what makes you very competitive at the gold medal can also affect your retention, which then the next Olympiad will mean that you're struggling. So that they're hoping that the fresh crop of athletes they brought in, people like, you know, Wyn Griffith and Tom Ford, those kind of athletes are going to come through in enough time to challenge for gold. But if they don't, they won't get funding.
Yeah.
If they don't win gold medals, they won't get the funding, and then you're in a whole nother issue. Because rowing in Britain doesn't have the same support as like American rowing from rich sort of ex-rowers.
Exactly right. And it's the impact is more than a single Olympiad as well. But reflecting back a little bit on the strictures around how you treat your athletes, I can say with my hand firmly on my heart, I'm extremely glad that we didn't have our dirty laundry washed in public like cycling did when Anne-Marie Phelps had to go and do an independent inquiry into the behaviours of a particular coach, which then gets published. And I think that was probably a very salutary lesson to a lot of sports to say, hang on a minute, let's just examine ourselves and check that we're on the right pathway. We may not be squeaky clean, but there are things that we need to change.
Yeah, well, you have to be spot on with your procedures, because I think millennials have got a whole new expectation about having a safe environment to work in and what that means. And therefore, you have to have procedures. So frankly, you can't have a coach by themselves telling an athlete you're not selected and then basically say, you know, don't appeal, you can't appeal, it'd be a waste of time. There has to be another person in there. There has to be an athlete friend. I mean, you know, you have to have procedures that work, and it has to be seen as a safe environment, because that's what young people expect these days.
But it's not just that. There's actually a bigger implication, Martin. For a long time, our athletes have had an employment contract with British Rowing. Is that correct?
Yeah.
If you're under an employment contract, it's no different than your job or my job. And what employer outside of sport is allowed to say, Martin, you didn't make the grade. You dropped from the crew, you dropped from the squad, or you got injured. And, you know, as a consequence, you're no use to me because I'm a sporting organization and I need a performing athlete, not a broken one. And they can simply drop you at the drop of a hat, and your funding gets cut pretty quickly, particularly if it's clear that you're not coming back for whatever reason. And from an employment law point of view, I cannot but believe that there aren't some major issues there that haven't yet been challenged.
Well, I think that there was a court case, wasn't there? Or maybe there's a case going through the courts about whether it was in terms of cycling that was challenging this particular concept of employment law and therefore duty of care. I do think that, I mean, I think, you know, bodies like British Rowing and you know, and other sports that employ athletes, I think they're behind the curve but having to catch up. I think one of the good things that British International Rowing was doing, I mean, it's introduced, so being concerned about the mental health of its athletes, you know, because of the pressures at Caversham, because who people have got to talk to, and clearly mental health and mental illness is something that's being more talked about now. And, you know, I was down doing an interview for the retirement of David Tanner and Anne-Marie Phelps, and there were a lot of, I thought, well, there's a lot of rowers here because it's like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They've generally gone home, and they were kind of, no, we're here for the third of our mental health seminars, and they were, you know, they'd employed a company, and, you know, to me, that's part of this duty of care, which, you know, all employers do have. Now, how much they're fulfilling that and what that actually means in terms of contracting is a very interesting issue, which I suspect might get played out in terms of the courts, possibly.
One other aspect of that, you probably remember the Irish lightweight international, Geraint Towie, Gags. He started a business called Crossing the Line Sport, and his business helps sporting organisations help their athletes through retirement, because apparently it is akin to coming off a drug habit. How do you retire from sport and begin to form the rest of your life in an effective and adult way that's fulfilling for you? And he spends a lot of time with organizations, not just with athletes, trying to explain to them that that duty of care goes beyond the finish line and the medal podium.
Yeah, well, I've done interviews with athletes, probably the two most powerful interviews I've ever done has been with Alex Partridge and Caroline Lynn for Row 360, and you can see them in back copies, and they were visceral about their experiences and what was available or not available from governing bodies at the time, and how retirement was for them. And I think there are more stories than that. I mean, they were particularly eloquent. It is, as I say, I think Rowan introducing those seminars about mental health, and I think part of the aspect of that is what happens when you do cross the line. And Gags has been great with that organisation. I know he's done some fantastic work with the cycling team that he's been involved with, but also, the workshops that he's had, with the likes of Sarah Cook and Kim Brennan in Australia, and fantastic speakers, really raising the profile of it. To the extent that is being athlete-led or ex-athlete led, which is really, I think, how that should work. And I think governing bodies are moving on that, albeit slowly.
I hope they are, because the dreadful sadness of a life destroyed by someone whose mental health is so affected by their leaving the sport and failing to find comfort and a space in the world that suits them after sport is just hideous. And he does actually, in his Twitter feed, highlight a very large number of suicides of athletes after leaving sport, including one who was due to speak at his own conference.
Yeah, well, I have to say that's shocking, and clearly that is very extreme, because that clearly is, I mean, is not the case for the vast majority of athletes. But any mental illness that is avoidable is something that governing bodies should think on, and clearly, things with athletes having a breakdown, or particularly even going to a case where they're contemplating doing stuff with their own health is shocking.
Let's move on to some more cheerful things. Who's going to go fast at the World Championships this year, Martin?
I don't know. I think, the hot crews last year were from the Aussies, and there was a fantastic race in the men's four. And I guess most people's expectation would be that the same four would be out again. I mean, from what I've heard, that's not going to be the case. The Aussies got a silver medal in the 8, they got a silver medal in the quad. They had a decent young pair that was in the small final. The 4 won just from the Italians. I wonder if we're not going to see a pair like the stern pair of that 4 come out and challenge the Croatians. Alex Hill and Jack Hargreaves, I think, were the stern pair. I know they're pretty quick in terms of all the percentages, like probably the highest percentage. I just wonder if we'll see them in a pair. And the question is then, if that's the case, what does Ian Wright do? Olympic qualification year is a lot of pressure. So then will he go, if the pair comes out first, will he go 4 next and then 8, or will he go 8, then 4? Basically, this is the year that coaches are not really worried so much about medals. They just want to tick the box of qualification. It's really an odd year.
What's going to happen in New Zealand? Because we've got Mahi, we've got Robbie, and we've also got Hamish Bond coming back into the squad.
Yeah, well, there was that very anticipating video of Mahi and Hamish in the pair. Hamish has been very definite that he wants to row in the 8. Like, he said that, and in all his press releases. so I'm taking it at face value. I cannot see Hamish wanting to do a pair with Mahe. Like, I can see him training. I thought it actually looked quite good. I did hear.
Noel Donaldson is a very good stirrer, and I have a lot of time and respect for him, and I count him as a friend. So it's a wind up from him, but he enjoyed the effects.
Yeah, but he's not working for New Zealand Rowing now. I just saw the New Zealand Rowing have parted company with him. But oddly enough, I was doing this thing for World Rowing, an article of the greatest rowers of all time, and I was struggling for a crew to put, for Mahe Drysdale, because there are a lot of scullers with like 3 Olympic gold medals and things like that, or 2 Olympics, and it was before 2016, and Mahe had his 2nd gold. So I bunged him in a 4. And I got a reaction from Eric Murray, who's like rowed with Mahe in 2004 in the Olympics in a 4. And he said, "What are you doing putting Mahe in a 4? You don't know what it's like to row with this guy." So, I did look at him in the pair and I thought, oh, he looks really quite smooth. It really looked quite nice in the paddle. Mahe said he's going to do the single, possibly, for another federation. He's mentioned Fiji.
He rescinded that. He is not eligible for any other federation this year.
To my way of thinking, Mahe still wants to be in the single. The quad, I think, was a great option for him. They were very unlucky not to medal at the World Championships. They were that much off winning a bronze medal. If the 8 could get round having, as I understand it, Mahe trains once a day, not twice a day.
On the water. He
goes cycling. The 8 might want to train twice a day, and I don't know quite how that'll work, having Mahe in an 8. And maybe, a coach is going to have to make adjustments for that. It's not to say it couldn't work. I think there are lots of... Hamish, when he rowed with Eric, Hamish did his single scull. That was his 2nd session. Eric went off and did the ergo or stuff like that, or Hamish went and did the bike. So Hamish and Mahe would fit together. If Hamish is in the 8, if he doesn't want to, if they're going to make adjustments, then possibly that might work to fit the 2 of them together. I'm sure stuff's being arranged or has been arranged now as we speak.
But for the Olympic year, Mahe still wants to be in the single. He got a little bit closer to Robbie at the national championships, but Robbie clearly didn't really perform after Lucerne last year. Do you think they were just overtrained?
Well, I think that was an issue in 2017. I talked to Robbie last year and said, well, what happened to you, in terms of those injuries? Because he broke that world record in Poznan. Yeah. And I think he basically thought he was invincible, almost invulnerable there. And I know that, they went on training camp after Poznan, him and his coach, Noel Donaldson there, and they did quite a lot of work. And so this year, after he raced in Linz, he said, I'm going to Munich and I'm not going to do too much. So it seemed that there was a bit of a lesson learned about overtraining. But clearly, if you look at his profile through the season, he's phenomenal. It's exactly the wrong profile. Because he's phenomenal at like the first World Cup.
The early regattas, yep.
But, it's people like Chettle Borsch. You look at them and, through the Europeans and the Worlds, the bloke's sculling like a dream. And he's phenomenal. And, talking to coaches, I talked with, the Czech performance director, Simon Cox, and he was really relaxed about Sinek getting beaten by Robbie Manson. He was going, well, let's see what happens at the Worlds. And of course, he was absolutely right, because like in 2017, Sinek took the gold medal. It was silver medal again last year.
Yeah.
So I think Robbie, in terms of having a coach and phasing, he's got that competition. I don't know whether the competition's too much with him, but he's got to be hitting it so fast. But clearly the phasing is wrong, and whatever has to happen, because the lad should be doing 6:30 at the Worlds, not at the second World Cup, basically.
Moving on, what's Steve Redgrave doing in China?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I think that knocked the rowing world for 6 when Steve got the job. He was saying to people it was his first proper job, because although he got paid for speaking engagements and things like that, you know, I think he might have had a proper job when he was maybe working as a builder when I used to row with him in the early 80s. But he was so chuffed to get that job, and it means so much to him. The thing is, China has been the graveyard of so many coaches, because you go with the best intent and you think it's going to be like another, you know, where you are in charge. But China's got so many layers of management, and it's such hierarchical authority that even like the rowing chief coach, like even Steve Redgrave, does not have necessarily the level of control that he would want, the level therefore of influence that he would want within the system. And you can look at any number of coaches that have worked in the Chinese system, either ones that have worked or ones that have gone out there to see if they could work. You know, I was talking with Gianni Postiglione, and he's been out there and he didn't feel he had the environment that he could, you know, produce what he wanted. So I think the biggest challenge for any coach that goes to work in China, and Steve included, is you know, how you can actually influence those above you so that what you want to happen can happen, like the training programs, where you want to go for training camps, all the regime, all the support stuff. And I think Steve has found that a particular challenge. They've clearly employed him as a name because he can bring people in. And, you know, in a sense, it would be a gift in terms of like someone like Tomo, British Rowing Sachs Tomo. The top boat for China in Tokyo will probably be the women's quad. That was the boat that beat Tomo in the 2008 Beijing Olympics, broke the British hearts of Catherine Granger and Annie Vernon, who's recently published a new book. And, you know, maybe Redders, I don't know, but maybe Redders has got Tomo to work in a consultancy role. That would be a great fit, I think, and a real win for Chinese rowing. And I think that's what he'd be judged on, how he can bring in coaches to work in that system.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. Now, I asked you before we started to have a little story ready for us. What have you got up your sleeve?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few stories, and I was running through stories, but you know, the one that springs to mind is I think it was I was rowing in a four, and there was it was a Cox four. It was John Maxey, Adam Cliff, myself, and John Garrett, and we were training, I think, for the Seoul Olympics. And we used to go to Zabaudia on training camp, and Zabaudia is a lake well known by a lot of nations, and the Italian team train there. They have their training centre there. A lot of nations go, and they stay on the beach. And we went one year, and the trailer rocked up, and the hotel is on the beachfront. So the Mediterranean's just out there, and people had to go and get their boats off the trailer and take them and kind of over to the rowing lake, which is the other side of the road, and basically go out rowing. And it was the first outing. And it happened, I think John and I were kind of a bit late from breakfast, and we kind of got there. We were the last pair to take our boat off the trailer, and kind of looking out to the sea was like an absolute mill pond. It was just like there were no waves whatsoever. And we just kind of looked at each other, and we just thought, because, you know, I'm a bit of a rebel, and John Garrett was up for it, and we just thought, should we go rowing on the sea? So basically, we kind of rigged up the boat, and we left our shoes on the beach, like a kind of warning, like, because we didn't tell anyone, which was probably a bit stupid. And we just went out, and you could see a boat in the far distance, but these things always look closer. And we probably went out about 10 kilometers into the Mediterranean Sea. Like, you could see the big mountain as about, you could see that was getting quite small. And then it was really, there was a kind of, and we kind of just stopped. We didn't quite get to the boat because I think we started to bottle it. There was no wind, but when we stopped, I kind of then just said, and then I looked at my rigger, and the top nut had come completely out. and it was just like about to fall out. And I thought, shit, we were just out in the middle of the sea. And luckily we got back safely, but it was one of the most amazing experiences and silly things to do, because we were part of the Olympics. You'd never do it in Jürgen's squad, but it was one of the most memorable things. The only time I've ever been like coastal rowing on the Mediterranean. So I treasure that memory and that time rowing on the Mediterranean.
Well, I think the call is out there. If you're a coastal rower and you'd like to teach Martin how to do it, get in touch.
Absolutely.
Martin, it's been a delight. Thank you for your insight and your knowledge and all of the things that you know, which I will continue to listen out for. Please tell the listeners where they can follow you and connect with you online.
Yeah, well, on social media, I'm generally around at Mark Crossy, and always interested to hear any views or to answer any questions. Occasionally I do a blog on the Blogging Oarsman or on YouTube. Not so much these days. Mostly I'm on World Rowing, and you can see me on their Facebook live feed at World Cups. I go and lucky enough to chat to athletes in maybe a less formal way and see how they're doing at regattas, and that's always quite fun. This year I'm going to be at all the World Cups and World Championships and some of the coastal rowing events as well.
Well, we look forward to seeing all of that. And for the listeners, please remember to check out our sponsor, rowtours.com/rowing-chat, because that's what keeps us going, is our generosity of our sponsors and you following through and clicking on their links. Please subscribe in iTunes or on the Google Play Store. We're on Stitcher, we're on Spotify. You can find us in most podcast apps. You can also discuss Rowing Chat in a couple of places. One is on the Reddit/rowing, and the other is on the Rowing Illustrated boards, where Sean Wolfe has opened up a new board specifically for podcast discussions. And we'll put a link to this chat into that room. Till next time, it's been delightful. Goodbye.
Thank you.